A few months ago, I began a sermon by singing a Beatles song for you. All You Need Is Love. I'm not going to do that again. But if I were going to, I would change the words just for today. Love ain't all you need. Okay? Love ain't all you need. If you need to fit that into the rhythm and to the notes, you can do that in your own mind. So, because if we were to compare the Christian life to a car, saying about the Christian life, love is all you need, about a car, it would be like saying gas is all you need. Gasoline is all you need. And while gasoline or, ethanol is essential, it's not the only component. If someone hands you a can of gasoline or ethanol and says, hey, that's all you need, you don't need to worry about the car, they'd be wrong. So it's essential, it's important, but it's not the most important component of a car. As it relates to the Christian life, I want you to cast your mind back 4 whole weeks. That's like almost a month since the last time we dove into 1 John. In chapter 3, the apostle has focused on the importance of love in the life of the believer. He has equated hatred to murder and compared those who do not love to Cain, who murdered his brother Abel. Then he turned to the positive example of love. If Cain is what hate looks like, then Jesus is what love looks like. And each believer is called to imitate the self-sacrificing love of Christ. We are not to love just with words and tongue, but with actions and in truth. Today we're going to examine John's closing statements of chapter 3. He's going to continue to talk about love later on in this epistle, but this is going to bring this particular section to an end. He's going to close it out with this. We'll be working with verses 19 through 24 of chapter 3, but in order to pick up the context and remind us of where we are, since it's been a while, we'll begin reading with verse 16. So 1 John chapter 3, beginning with verse 16. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. If anyone has material possessions and sees his brother in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. This, then, is how we know that we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence whenever our hearts condemn us. For God is greater than our hearts, and he knows everything. Dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence before God and receive from him anything we ask, because we obey his commands and do what pleases him. And this is his command: to believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and to love one another as he commanded us. Those who obey his commands live in him, and he in them. And this is how we know that he lives in us. We know it by the Spirit he gave us. Out of this passage, I want to draw out 3 things that love is, and 1 thing that love is not. Here's number 1. Loving others is evidence that we belong to God. That's how John summarizes the command to love. We are to love not with words and tongue, but in actions and in truth. And the next statement is, this is how we know we belong to the truth. It's evidence. It's not how we belong to the truth. Loving others doesn't make us belong to the truth, but it's evidence that flows out of that belonging. And let's recall briefly how we are to love. The guiding principle, according to 1 John, is sacrifice for the good of another. That's what love is. And we love with our time. We love with our possessions. We love with our convenience. Not at our convenience, but with our convenience. We love with our talents. And we even love with our pleasures. Sacrificing these things which to us are oh so precious in order to benefit others. Just as Jesus sacrificed his position, his life, his honor, his dignity in order to bless us. And just briefly, I want to state what the greatest threat to love is. The greatest threat to love is self. We talked about this a lot when we were studying the Gospel of Mark. Love is outward focused, right? Love is concerned with self-sacrifice for the good of the other. But what does self do? Self asks of every situation and every circumstance, how can this benefit me? How can I best manipulate this situation or this person or this event to bring about what I want? So note the difference. Love is selflessness, whereas the opposite and the greatest threat to that is then selfishness, a self-focus. So firstly, love is evidence that we belong to the truth. Secondly, loving others is a factor in our personal assurance of salvation. So let me repeat that because that's long and wordy. Loving others is a factor in our personal assurance of salvation. It's not the only assurance we have, but it is a factor. So do any of you struggle from time to time to know if you are saved or not? Is that a concern that comes to your mind? Do you have those accusing, horrifying thoughts from time to time or doubts that suggest to you, maybe I'm not really saved? Now, John answers that accusation in part here by saying that loving others is an aspect of that assurance. He says this, meaning loving others, is how we set our hearts at rest in His presence, in God's presence, whenever our hearts condemn us. So when we have those terrifying thoughts, those questioning thoughts, John says, examine your life. Do I love others? If the answer is yes, that is evidence that we're saved. And remember, loving others, it's primarily about action, not primarily about feelings. Love is founded in the will, not the emotions. That's why we can be commanded to love. Nowhere in Scripture does God ever command His people to feel a certain way. But we are often told to act in a certain way. So, loving others is about action. Now, why? Why is love? Why would love be an assuring factor? Self-sacrifice is not a natural human quality. The only time fallen human nature will sacrifice itself is if there is something that self will get out of it. Those who belong to Christ are going to struggle against that reality. Will not simply follow our own selfish desires. So we can examine ourselves and ask, do I choose to love others by sacrificing my own time, my own pleasure, my own convenience, my own possessions, my own talents for their good? If you are committed to doing so, and you see that evidence in your life, that fact contributes to the assurance that you are saved and that you belong to God. Now, thirdly, loving others gives us confidence before God in prayer. If our hearts are at rest before God, if we have examined our lives and found evidence through love that we belong to the truth and are saved, we can have confidence to approach God as Father and ask for anything. The way John puts it is, if our hearts do not condemn us. If our hearts don't condemn us, then we're confident before God to ask and to receive. We don't self-sabotage. A few weeks ago, maybe months ago, I was in the store, grocery store, and I went to the deli counter, and I asked the salesperson there, I said, what's the cheapest queijo prato that you have? And she told me, I don't remember the brand, it was one I hadn't heard of before. She told me, and I said, great, I would like 150 grams, sliced of that cheese. And she didn't move. She just stood there looking at me. And I said it again, I want 150 grams. And she said, "Are you sure?" And I was quite taken aback. I mean, this person's responsibility is to sell this to me. You know, it's a new brand. They have it on sale. They have it advertised. Her responsibility. And I was like, now I'm not so sure, right? So I said, why? And she said, again, truly, it's not very good. And I said, really? And she said, do you want to try a little bit? And I said, well, yes, I think I do. Maybe I don't. So she surreptitiously gave me a little sample. And let me just say, she was right. She was right. And in this context, I was very grateful to her for doing this. But that image of this salesperson who doesn't have any faith in what they're selling at all, you know, and in fact is not only has no faith in it, but is actively convincing people not to buy it. You know, that person has no confidence in their product. When we approach God with our hearts condemning us, you know, this is the image that John gives. We self-sabotage. We have no confidence before the Lord, and it might look like this. How can we come to Him with humble, bold confidence? To ask, as our Father. I'm not really sure I belong to you. I might, but probably not. I'm not sure if I'm your daughter. I'm not sure if I'm your son. You probably won't hear me, and you probably don't even care. But will you help me out? If our hearts condemn us and we don't have confidence before God, then many times that might even lead us not to ask. Not even to enter His presence. Not to approach Him as Father. But John says, if we can look at our lives and see evidence of loving others, that's going to help put our hearts at peace. And if our hearts are at peace in God's presence, then we have the freedom to ask and we'll receive whatever we ask, is what he says here. Now, we like that phrase, don't we? Receive anything you ask. And there are two ways, I'm guessing right now, there are two ways that when you heard that phrase that you responded internally. One was, wow, really? Anything I ask. All right, I've got a list. Here it goes, God. And start, I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this, I need this, please do this, please do this, please do this. That's one way. But I think that most of us do not respond that way. Most of us respond a different way. We look at that and we don't say it out loud, but we say, that's not true. That's not true. Because my own personal experience goes directly against that. I've asked for a lot of things, God, that you've never given me. I've asked you to do a lot of things that you've never done. And those around me that I know, I've prayed with them, I've heard them pray for you to answer, for you to do, for you to act, for you to give, and you haven't. So, what do we do with this statement? Where he says, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence before God, and we receive from Him anything we ask, because we stop the reading there. What's the next word? Because. Because. So in other words, it's saying, receiving anything you ask is a result. There is a cause that's going to bring about that result. It's like kids when they know that there is dessert after the meal. And all they've heard is dessert. And that what they did not hear or chose to ignore was when mom or dad said, if you eat your meal. Or after you eat your meal, then you will have dessert. Mike is a master at this, man. After every bite, he'll say, is it time for dessert yet? We're like, Micah, you have to eat your whole meal. He'll take another bite. Can I have dessert yet? Okay, this is not in my notes, but just to be clear, fruit, not dessert. I just want to establish that. You know, growing up at our home, we had good food always, but often dessert was fruit salad. And as a child, I came to understand fruit salad is not dessert. I'm just laying that out there, okay? Fruit can be mixed with other things to make it a dessert, but on its own, it's good, I love it, it's sweet, it's wonderful, not dessert. Let's call it what it is, okay? So the kids here, they hear dessert. What they don't hear is if you eat your meal first. So we read this and we hear, you'll receive anything you ask, and we don't hear because. And what is this because that John lays out? What are the conditions for this to happen? He says, you have confidence before God, receive anything you ask, because we believe, backing up, because we obey and we do what pleases Him. Dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence before God and receive from Him anything we ask because we obey His commands and do what pleases Him. That's the condition. Obeying His commands and doing what pleases Him. But John doesn't even leave it that vague. He gets more specific. So he says, now, let's talk about what we're supposed to obey. Let's talk about the actual commands. He lays it out, and this is His command. Two aspects, twofold. To believe, right? To believe and to love. That's the command that we are called to obey. To believe in the name of His Son, Jesus Christ. And that's more than just intellectual assent. So remember all the attacks against the person and nature of Jesus that John addresses in the first 2 chapters. His opponent said that Jesus was not the Son of God. They said He was not divine, that He was not the Messiah, and some were saying that He had never taken on human flesh, that the incarnation did not happen. But believing the truth about Jesus, about His identity, about His power, about who He is, that's the primal act of obedience to which we are called. And I'm going to take that one step further in saying that believing implies surrendering. Because to believe who He is should and will inevitably lead to surrender to Him. Because James, in his epistle, reminds us that even the demons believe that there's one God. Same word, believe. They believe that there is one God and shudder. Listen, the demons are not saved. Okay, they are not believers. So when he says to believe in His Son Jesus Christ, he's saying, yes, we assent to the truth of who Jesus is, to His identity and those things, yes. But it's more than that. It's a lifestyle that is compatible to that belief. Okay? Surrender. And if belief is a command, it follows that belief is a choice. And we often don't see belief that way. We see it as something that magically happens to me or to someone. I go to bed and I don't believe. I wake up in the morning, oh, I believe. But John's saying belief is a choice. It's an act of obedience. Choosing to believe the truth and to surrender to Christ. It's an act of obedience. And then he says the second command that we are to obey is to love one another. Now listen. If you haven't gotten that yet, from 1st and 2nd John, either this is your first Sunday with us here at Calvary International Church, or it's your first Sunday here in over 7 months. Because John has emphasized this over and over and over again. Why does he do that? Why does he keep insisting on this point? And that phrase in English comes to mind, stop beating a dead horse. But he emphasizes it because remember who he's writing against. He's writing against these people who are saying, look, knowledge of God has nothing to do with how you live. So we can know God, we can be saved, we can have this esoteric knowledge, this spiritual experience of God, and it doesn't have to have any impact on our actions, on our ethics, on our morality, on our lives. And John says, absolutely not. Any true encounter and knowledge of God is going to transform the way we live. There's going to be evidence of this in this. So if we know God, we are going to love our brothers and sisters. Now, how does this relate back to prayer? If we're fully surrendered to Jesus, and if we're perfectly loving toward others, we will always ask for what is good and right. I want you to think about that for a moment. If we are fully surrendered to Christ and believe He is who He says He is, that He is the Son of God, that He is incarnate, that He died for our sin to pay the price for evil in humanity, and He rose again to save us, we believe that, we surrender to Him, and we are perfectly loving toward everyone else in the world. Then we're going to ask for what is good and right. So receiving what we ask is a result of asking well. And asking well proceeds from surrender and obedience. Now, what's the human way to look at this? Okay, I want to get whatever I ask for. So what do I have to do to make that happen? Oh, I got to love others and I got to obey. I got to believe. Okay, I'm going to do that. Now watch me, God. I'm going to do this, and then you're going to be obligated to give me everything I ask for. If that's our attitude, we've missed the point. That is self-defeating, because where's the focus? The focus is on me and what I'm going to get. Consider what James writes about prayer, the similar theme in James chapter 4, verse 3. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your own pleasures. Later on here in 1 John, the apostle is going to affirm this. This is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to His will, He hears us. Now that might seem like circular reasoning, but of course it makes sense, because the more fully surrendered and obedient we are, the more closely we will be like Christ and ask for those things that please Him, that are in accordance with His will. So the image that John's giving is the closer that we are to Christ, the more conformed we are to His image, the more transformed we are into His likeness, the more our concerns and our requests are going to be in line with His character and His will. And as that happens, He will be glad and blessed to answer everything that we ask. But if our focus is on what we can get, we've lost already. We've lost already. We believe and obey, not because of what we can get, but because Jesus is the Son of God. 3 things that loving others is. Loving others is evidence that we belong to the truth. Loving others is one factor of our assurance of our salvation, and loving others gives us confidence before God in prayer. But here's the main point. Number 4, loving others is not salvation. And loving others does not save us. Do you see, however, why it might be easy after reading this passage to say, love is all you need? Look at all these things that love does. But you may have noticed that I skipped over an important phrase in this passage, an important verse, and it's a phrase of mercy and grace and peace. This passage was not meant by John to weigh us down and condemn us. It was meant to be an encouragement to the true church. He uses that interesting phrase, whenever our hearts condemn us. Well, why might our hearts condemn us? Why might my heart condemn me? Because if I look at my life honestly and sincerely, I'm going to see that I don't love perfectly. I'm going to see that I consistently struggle to walk in full surrender, that I release something to the Lord and then I try to take it back. I might see that I struggle in obedience, that my obedience is spotty at best, and that I see less evidence of belonging to God in my life than I would like to see. I don't see perfection. I don't see the same holiness as Christ has. And so as we approach God, we're aware that we don't measure up to that standard. And if my assurance of salvation is based purely on how well I love other people, I've got to be honest, I don't love them well enough for salvation. So what did I skip? God is greater than our hearts, and He knows everything. This then is how we know that we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in His presence whenever our hearts condemn us. For God is greater than our hearts, and He knows everything. We can never be perfect enough to earn our salvation, but we're constantly tempted to try. Say, all I need is love, so tomorrow I'm going to try harder and harder to love so I can be saved. I'm going to love better. I'm going to sacrifice more so I can be sure I'm saved and sure that I belong to God. But I'll be, if you are waiting, if you are trying to get to the point where you can convince yourself that your efforts and your virtue have earned you salvation, that you love everybody perfectly enough, you're never going to get there. And let me add this. If you ever think you have gotten there, what would that look like? I'm a lover. I love everybody perfectly. All the time. I am the ultimate sacrificer. I sacrifice for everyone perfectly every time. Anything you want, anything you need, I'll do for you. Show me a command in the Bible that I don't obey. If you ever get to that point, you're failing. Because those attitudes that I just enacted or described, those are the opposite of love. And if you get to that point where you think you have achieved perfection and you are going to look down at everybody else around you and you are going to say, you poor, pathetic, hopeless imbeciles, why can't you be like me? And you will become judgmental and insufferable and arrogant. God is greater than our hearts, and our salvation is from Him, not from our efforts. That's the point John's making. Your efforts are not enough. God's greater than your efforts. And your salvation does not depend on your efforts. Now consider the last phrase of this section. We know He lives in us, not by loving others, but by what? By His Spirit that He has given us. Now, I know for many of us, we say, whoa, that's way too subjective. Holy Spirit, what does that mean? That's uncomfortable. How do we know? What is the Spirit? That's subjective. Anyone can claim that something's from the Spirit, but we're missing the point. What John's saying here is simply, listen, God has given believers His Spirit. Take it. Accept it as the gift that it is. And the Spirit is the guarantee of God's life in you. He's saying, you want a guarantee? I'll guarantee it. How? I'm putting my Spirit to live in you. This is how invested the Father is in His children, that He would live inside them. Is this a guarantee that all true believers will speak in tongues? That all true believers are going to have an experience of being baptized by the Spirit? No, it does not. In fact, I think John has deliberately left this statement indefinite. He wants us to be pleased with the gift and the reality that God is guaranteeing His presence and life in us by His Spirit. But I will say that there's an implied question in this passage that we have to answer. Where does the desire and concern for love come from? So we're told here, love others, love others, love others, obey, 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 believe, believe, believe. Where do those things come from? Where do the desires come from? The desires to obey? Where does that strength of will come from to choose obedience, even when we would rather have something else? Then we would choose to sacrifice self for the good of someone else when we would rather not. Where does that discipline come from? We can only come to God if He draws us. And a concern to love, a desire to obey, a daily recommitment to surrender, a concern to do what pleases God, that's evidence of the work of the Holy Spirit. Because even that concern would never come from self. They are evidence that the Spirit is present in God's children, that we are being sanctified, that we have been justified and are being transformed. The foundational truth is that our salvation comes from God, not from our efforts. Now we need to keep these in balance and in order. Our obedience, our love, flow out of our salvation. They do not earn us salvation, but they are evidence of it. And John consistently says, remember, if you have truly encountered God, you will seek obedience. If you truly belong to Him, you will seek others. But then he makes it clear in this passage, you know what? That's your goal, and you need to be actively engaged in meeting that goal, but you're going to fail. You're not going to do it perfectly. That's because, and the mercy in that, the grace in that, is that God's greater than your failures. But that is what we are called to as God's children. We can do this because God is greater than our hearts and He knows everything, and we can rest in His assurance, His Spirit, and His love. The fact that we need something beyond ourselves for salvation is illustrated so beautifully in the table of communion in the Lord's Supper. Because when Jesus enacted that to His disciples, do you remember? He said, "This is my body which is broken for you. This is broken for you. You need it. This is my blood which is shed for you. You need it. Because on your own, you're not enough." And such a beautiful image of us receiving into ourselves that which we so desperately need. It's not our own flesh. It's not our own blood. It's the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And as our physical bodies are nourished by the bread and the juice that we eat and we drink, there's that image of our physical bodies receiving, and as our physical bodies receive, our spiritual selves, our soul is receiving the ministry of God to us in His Son, Jesus Christ.